Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Eddie Shleyner. Eddie is a copywriter, content marketer, and the founder of verygoodcopy.com, a blog and a newsletter about copywriting and creativity that has more than 53,000 subscribers and has been chosen twice as the email newsletter of the year by HackerNoon. He's also a LinkedIn top voice in marketing and advertising with more than 92,000 followers and over 1 million content views per month. As a copywriter, he's done work for people like Google, Forbes, HubSpot, and Yelp, and was chosen as Marketing MVP of the Year during his time as copy chief at G2.com. Eddie is a master storyteller, and I constantly learn from his weekly emails. So you can imagine how heartbroken I was when he turned down coming on the show. In fact, he actually accepted coming on the show, listened to it, and then turned it down. And it's only taken me 2 years to convince him this would be very good fun. And by the face he's making right now, I might have already gotten us off on the wrong foot. So no pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, the non-drunk Hemingway of copy, Eddie Shleyner. Eddie, welcome to the show.
Wow, Francisco, that was an amazing intro. I really appreciate you, and I am sorry that it's taken so long to come on. I'm glad I'm here now, though, so I appreciate you.
I one of the things I found out when I was doing the sort of the research that I normally do for these shows was that you and I have some weird things in common. So we're both foreigners. I mean, you're not American originally. Neither am I. So I'm from Brazil. You are from where again in Eastern Europe?
I was born in Ukraine. I was born in Kiev.
Okay. And we are both English majors, I believe.
Yes, I studied English and literature and narrative in college, yeah.
Yes, same here. But do you remember by any chance what was your final paper?
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh. My final paper. I wrote so many papers in college. You know, that's what we did as English majors. So I don't remember what it was. I don't even know if I remember any one specific paper from college. I feel like that was so long ago. Do you remember your last paper?
Oh, I do. And for regular listeners of this show, I'm sorry you're gonna have to hear this again, but I don't get many English majors on this show. But yes, my final paper had the most pretentious title I think any final paper in English literature ever had. It was called "I Wanted to Breathe Smoke: Violence, Self-Destruction, and the Search for Meaning from American Psycho to Fight Club."
Wow, it sounds fascinating. At least, how long was it? You're talking about like a thesis. This was like your thesis.
Yeah,
paper
the final paper I did, to get me out of university and find out that my degree had absolutely no use in the real world. Yes, that paper.
Right. I guess I never really had a thesis paper that I had to write. I had to write. There were some classes where I had to write. I remember only papers. So I had like four papers that I had to turn in throughout the semester, and they were all 25% of my grade. Or there was like tests, and then the test was 50% of your grade, and then the paper was 50% of your grade, or something like that. But I never had like an actual thesis, like a dissertation or a master's or anything like that. So I never wrote anything like that. But I actually English is one of those degrees where I feel like I've used it a lot because it really taught me, I think, how to think, broadly speaking, which I think is pretty typical for like that type of like non-technical degree. You know what I mean? Like you just kind of like you come out of college with an education like that, and you learn to see things in a different way. You learn to notice things. You learn. I guess I learned how to write a little bit, but really my writing education happened after college. I think, after I got a job as a writer, as a copywriter, that's when I really started to learn how to write well. And in college, I feel like I was really just learning how to think about things and think about narrative and think about characters and think about, I guess, storytelling more broadly. But after college is when I think I became a much better writer. Um, because before college, when I was studying literature, I was kind of writing like a fire hose. I was writing very long, flowery sentences. Um, I really didn't appreciate brevity or concision. And it was only after I became a copywriter that those things became important. And so I had to kind of, really, really in earnest make an effort to learn how to write clearly and concisely, with brevity in mind. Yeah.
It's interesting because a lot of people, when I tell them that I have an English literature degree, they always assume that makes complete sense given that I work now with storytelling. And then I always think to myself, I mean, I'm happy to let you believe that, but I'm not sure that like any of the storytelling that I do now, I struggle to see how any of that were things that I learned through university. I mean, I read a ton of books. I've always read a ton of books. That obviously helps. But when I think back of the types of things we looked at in university, I remember some really interesting classes that looked at the motives of characters and looked at representation and looked at different ways of portraying different things. And there's this one class in particular that I remember. There was a class about Gothic literature. And there was one, the professor was amazing, was the guy who ended up being the mentor for my final paper. And I remember when we looked at Dracula, and he said, Dracula was a book very much of its time, and one of the things Dracula did that was completely uncommon is Dracula is not told through narration. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, well, pay attention when you're reading. It's a newspaper article, and then it's a recording that Van Helsing made. It's a letter from Mina Harker to someone. Like the whole book is these different types of media, and they're using that to convey the story. And I also always remember how he talks about how Dracula was the personification of all fears of the time. So Dracula was a foreigner. He had like dubious sexuality. He was very concerned about money, so there was perhaps some like a Jewish angle to what they were saying. And none of those things are things you'd necessarily pick up on if somebody doesn't point you to it. So that
Right.
type of stuff I remember getting a lot more tuned in because of university. The writing itself, not so much.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think a lot of an English education is really learning to understand understand what the writer was doing. Not necessarily how the sentences were structured or the words that were being used, but like how what they were doing to create that kind of emotional connection or to relay that message. I remember starting studying like literary minimalism and realism in college. So Raymond Carver, Hemingway, Bukowski, a lot of these writers use techniques that like literary realism, like minimalism, where you didn't really get to hear the thoughts or the internal perspective of the characters. You really just got to, the author just showed you what the character was saying and what the character was doing. Um, and this created kind of voids in the writing, like holes in the writing that the reader had to fill in for herself. And when you do that as a reader, you fill it in with your own worldview, your own kind of perspective, your own lived experiences, and that makes the writing much more realistic in a way, much more palpable. And so that's a lot of what I do now. I've taken that certainly um, from my education and used it a lot in my writing now. I'm very good copy, and in general in copywriting, is I don't really let the reader know what my characters, or if I'm writing about myself, what I'm thinking in that moment. I'm really kind of just trying to show them a picture of like what's going on, almost like a vignette, like a moment in time. You know, telling the reader what the character is saying, telling the reader what the character is doing, and then letting them fill in the holes for themselves. And this creates much more kind of visual experience for the reader, I think.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed you do a lot, and it's not it wasn't naturally the way I told stories or wrote stories. But one thing I notice is that when I'm writing a story, and which is typically something I'm going to post on LinkedIn, what I've noticed is that using dialogue without any exposition, or basically no non-realistic exposition, is, well, one, makes for a better story, but more importantly, makes for a shorter story. Because, and this was surprising to me once I started realizing it, is how much you can infer in a way that gives the audience enough context by just the way characters talk to each other. Whereas if you try to use exposition, it just becomes lengthy. And I was like, but I can say this with one line of dialogue and get that, okay, this is a family dynamic that has been going on for a while. If I say, oh, you know how our uncle is. But if I try to do that in long form of exposition, it just becomes a horrible long sentence. Like, my uncle is the type of person who, and it's never a, I don't ever find it as good. I don't know if that is a motivating reason to use realism when you do it, or is that just a byproduct of it?
No, I think it is a motivating reason. I mean, people, that's how people communicate in general, right? We have conversations with one another. And just like you and I are sitting here, I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know what's going on in your head. I can only infer based on what you're doing, uh, and what you're saying, based on what your face is doing, based on what your body language is doing, and based on the words that you're speaking. And that's typically how, um, people communicate. I mean, nobody is a mind reader. And so when you write that way, um, it becomes a much more realistic situation, for the reader, because we have to infer all the time, and our minds are racing all the time when we're, with other people. We're always kind of like, consciously or otherwise, processing information and trying to make something of it. And so when you do the same thing in writing, you get the same result, and becomes much more, realistic and compelling. So it's definitely a motivating factor. I do it consciously, I think, when I write.
I guess the question I have when I think about using realism as the main form of storytelling, well, for the first one I have is, I think it works a lot better in writing than it does orally. I think it's difficult. I haven't tried it with any great effort so far, but I find that when you are telling the story, if you don't fill in some of the things about how you're feeling, sometimes it's harder to give that impression because you're not describing necessarily your actions, or you cannot describe your actions in a way that is as evocative as you would in writing, because it will sound forced. People don't talk that way. So if you tried using evocative imagery, it might just sound a bit weird. Like, why are you describing it that way? And this has been my experience. And the other concern would be that might not people might not get it, right? I think you need to be a better writer to convey everything you need to convey if you're not going into the characters' minds and feelings at all, than if you're saying it. And sometimes if you don't do that well, the lesson of the story that you're, assuming that you're trying to get a lesson or a point out of that story, it might feel tacked on if you haven't done a good enough job of getting everything else across with the realistic approach. So that's my not resistance. I don't have any resistance. It's my reservations to it.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, yeah, and sometimes, I think of stories like Hills Like White Elephants, like the Ernest Hemingway story about the pregnancy and the abortion, and how, you know you really had to read between the lines there, and you really had to think about that story, and you had to arrive at it independently. The reader had to really be thoughtful about what Hemingway was trying to say. And um, sometimes that's more interesting as a reader than if everything is kind of spoon fed to you. or if everything is kind of laid out very clearly and precisely. And so there is this I guess there is this benefit to making the reader think for herself and be thoughtful, um, and maybe not necessarily know exactly what's happening. Not have any kind of definitive answer to what's happening. It's kind of like there's this technique. Hemingway does it. Raymond Carver does it a lot. It's called the zero ending, where you end the story in the middle of an epiphany. Essentially, the characters is having this experience, whatever it may be, and the story ends at the point at which they go through some sort of transformation. They have a new perspective on the world, or they have a new perspective on the situation that they're in, or they, their worldview changes. And by leaving the story in that moment, it's very powerful, because now the epiphany that the character just had becomes an epiphany for the reader. And the reader takes that epiphany into their life, and it transcends the story. It's not just on paper anymore. Now you have to walk around as a person with this epiphany, with this knowledge, with this new worldview that the character had. And so that's one way that literature changes us, I think, by giving us a perspective that we have to carry with us now, for better or worse sometimes. And so that's not always, very rarely has the author made that clear, what that epiphany is, or what that new worldview is. It's just there for you to kind of hold with you, and so it's very powerful. And so sometimes it's not necessary to, I guess, spell it all out. And I try to think about that as well. It doesn't always work. It's not the most popular way to write on social media, per se. You know what I mean? It's not, you're not going to get as many as many people understanding it, and so you're not going to get as much play. But the people that do get it, I think it'll stay with them longer, and it'll be more profound for them, and maybe those will become more loyal, more fervent kind of readers of yours.
Let me just understand that, because I think I know exactly what you're referring to, but let me just be 100% clear, because if I go off on my own thinking about what you just said, I want to make sure I get it perfectly right. So when you say the zero ending is in that the author is not spelling things out, what you're saying is that they've had the epiphany. You can clearly see on the page that something has happened and something has changed for them, but the story ends there. There's no, okay, and then after that, this is how their lives changed or anything like that. You have to imagine that, or you have to try and figure out what's happening. Is that what you mean by zero ending?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, a great example, anybody who's listening wants a great example of a zero ending. It's a story called Cathedral by Raymond Carver. Probably my favorite short story. And it's about a couple who's being visited by the wife's friend. The wife's friend happens to be a blind man, and the husband is prejudiced against blind people, against people with disabilities in general. He's not very woke. He doesn't have he doesn't have sympathy or compassion for people, I think, the way that most people do, or most people should. And so throughout the story, he's telling the reader all these derogatory things about this blind person, making fun of him, to his wife, being in general kind of an asshole. And at the end of the story, after they've met, and after the blind person comes in and has dinner, they're sitting on the couch, and his wife goes to sleep, and they turn on the TV, and this is before, the story takes place before we had cable or anything. There's only a few channels on TV, and one of the channels, it's kind of like a PBS documentary about cathedrals. And they're watching and they're listening, and the husband asks their guest if he even knows what a cathedral looks like, if he could even imagine what a cathedral looks like, because he can't see. And his guest says, well, why don't you get a pen, and why don't you get, a shopping bag, like a paper shopping bag, and bring it back, and we'll do something. And he goes and he gets a shopping bag. He takes the onion skins from out of the bag, which is a great visual in and of itself. But he takes this bag and he brings it back. He brings a pen, and the blind man, starts asking him to draw the cathedral, and the husband starts drawing it, and he starts adding more detail to it. And eventually the blind man puts his hand on the husband's hand and kind of traces it with him. And you could tell that he's starting to see the cathedral, the blind person. And you could tell that through some exposition, the husband is starting to understand that he's helping this man see the cathedral through this exercise. And I think, if I remember correctly, the story ends with the wife waking up and coming downstairs and saying, what are you doing? And the blind man says, we're drawing the cathedral. And the husband says, it's really something. And that's it. And that's the end of the story. It's just this one sentence, it's really something. And then that's the end, and the book ends. It was the last story, I think, in the anthology. And that's a perfect example of a zero ending, because it's this whole buildup, it's this whole, Carver is showing you this person that has completely perverted worldview, and a completely wrong worldview as far as I'm concerned. But then through this exercise, he comes into something else. He comes into the light, and he realizes maybe that he was wrong. Maybe not just in this moment, but maybe he realizes that he was wrong throughout his entire life, and he sees many moments where he was wrong. He sees many moments where he let people down, and he let himself down. And Carver leaves you with that epiphany. And who knows who the reader is? Maybe the reader shares that opinion. Carver wrote that story in the 80s. I'm sure a lot of people had that opinion of blind people or people with disabilities. You feel me? And so I think that by leaving you with that epiphany, and by making the reader take that epiphany into their own lives, into their own real world, that zero ending did something for them, and that's the power of it, I think. So it was a really, I feel bad I talk so much, and I kind of explain so much of the story, but in a way, that's what zero endings are supposed to do. They're supposed to take you on this long journey, and they're supposed to be long, and they're supposed to have one perspective through 99% of it, and that last 1%, when everything changes, that's where they leave you. And then suddenly everything changes, everything's different.
Yeah. So where I think that is different than what I was thinking of, because when it comes to oral storytelling, at least, I think the best stories end right after the moment of change, but it's not always possible to convey that, or at least that's not something that's done as much in oral storytelling, is conveying that you've gone through that massive change without any reference to your feelings or through how you think, or there are lines like, and this was the last time that that's usually the most minimal approach that people take to avoid giving like a moral of the story, but you just imply very strongly how you've changed, even though you don't go into detail of what happened in your life after. I think I haven't tried the. I don't think I've tried the zero ending in when I tell a story orally to someone. I think in paper I've done that loads of times, but yeah, I might have to toy around with it because the concern I think would always be if you're doing it kind of in real time and the person is right there, and particularly if you're doing this in a business type of context, so it's a potential client, you're speaking as I do, there's only so much you can let people sit with the story and let it work on them, because I think some people watch stuff like this, or you're watching a TV show and it might not hit you straight away. You might go, huh, let me just reread those last final line. How can I? Okay, fine. No, I think, and you can go back to parts of the story, or whatever. If you're doing this in real time and this is a conversation and you're using the story to convey a particular point, then I think a zero ending might require a lot more skill to pull off. And I know that the oral storytelling is not really your thing. You I think everything you do is quote unquote on the page. But yeah, I'm just trying to translate some of these techniques, and I think some of them might be slightly harder to pull off if unless you're a tremendous storyteller that can do that in real time, and you know for sure people get it straight away. But
Yeah.
having said
Yeah.
that, I do think that one of the most incredible skills that any storyteller can develop, regardless if it's on the page or in person or orally, is what are the sentences or words that you can use that convey a universe of meaning without you having to spell it out. And I remember I heard this story by someone who's not a professional storyteller or anything, and she was talking about her childhood, and it was something like, she's playing with her sisters, and then the door opens, she knows it's her father, and then the sisters run upstairs and sort of hide, and they start just peeking through and say, so we're looking to see how our dad looks when he comes in, so we know if it's going to be a good day or not. And that alone can tell you not exactly what happened in that kid's childhood, but it's like, well, there's a tension there that you can grasp. There's a dynamic that you can kind of understand. I think she might have implied a little more than I'm remembering, that maybe they should, like, or something like, we know when we look at him if this is a day we have to hide until he goes to sleep, until he falls asleep on the sofa or something, or falls asleep at the table. And you could clearly get an idea this guy's probably a drunk, or at least is violent, or there's something wrong with the dynamic between the father and the children. But they don't say any of that. It was just, is this a night we have to hide, or is it a good night? And I always find that when I read stories, I try to say, okay, well, what can I just have a character say that sounds natural, that eliminates a whole bunch of exposition, and not always easy to do, but it tends to work much better when you can pull it off.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Um, yeah, I was actually just there's this uh there's this thing called the Schmidt um Sting Index, I think it's called. It's the Schmidt Sting Index, and it's basically this uh, a scientist went out and got stung by a bunch of poisonous insects, and wrote about the stings, and he wrote about like how painful they were on a scale of 1 to 4, and he wrote about the paper wasp sting. He gave it a 1.5 out of 4, and he described it as a lonely pain. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's just like that word lonely is so loaded, It could be lonely in the sense that, hey, it's just like really concentrated on that one point where it was stung. It's not like going through your entire arm or something. It's just like in that one spot. But lonely is so loaded in a lot of different ways, It's just like this. It's this emotional thing, loneliness, and like maybe that's what he was alluding to. We don't really know. He could have been alluding to the physical part of it, but I like to think he was talking about just this the loneliness of a wasp's thing is that you have to endure it alone, that you have to endure it by yourself. Nobody can help you, nobody can make it better. You just have to sit with it. And that's a very lonely feeling sometimes. Just like it might be lonely when you lose someone or you lose something, and there's nothing that can really help you come out of that situation. You just have to sit with it and let it kind of come over you. And so that's one of those words where it's kind of could be physical, it could be something else.
Yeah, it's very evocative. Something else I wanted to ask you in very specific storytelling technique is to do with how you start a story, because what I noticed when I'm comparing the way I start a story when I'm telling it and when I'm writing it, particularly if I'm writing it for social media, which is the mean that I normally write stories in, is that when I'm telling it, doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't need to be particularly catchy as long as the beginning sounds like a story, which usually involves a time and place. If you give a time and place, then it sounds like a story, and I think all the brain triggers that are engaged when a story happens, they are engaged, and then off to the races you go. When I write it, though, particularly on social media, because we have this whole stop the scroll thing and all of that, I find that I have to be a lot more, either I have to be a lot more thoughtful about my first line, or I use this technique that I haven't used it in a while actually, which is I get the strangest line from the story, the strangest piece of dialogue from the story, and I put it up there without any context.
Hmm.
So that's been what I found when I was trying to write stories. Now, a lot of the stories you write are in your newsletter. I don't think people are about to close the email after they read the first two lines because it was too boring. But do you pay particular attention to how you start the story, or not so much?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think in a way part of what you're describing might be like in media res, that technique, starting in the middle of things, where you drop your reader in the middle of a problem, or you drop your reader in the middle of a conflict, or something strange, something inexplicable. I think Bukowski started his first novel, Post Office, with it started as a mistake. Well, what started as a mistake? You kind of get people to ask that question. Um, so yeah, I always like to, not always, but oftentimes I start with dialogue, and the way I write is, I think, on Very Good Copy I write these little articles, these little micro articles, but they have three elements to them. So they have the story, the narrative, and then they have the lesson that I'm trying to teach. So the takeaway about um, creativity or copywriting, and then I have like a word count. So say I want to write this thing in 350 words. So uh, for me, it's like, okay, well, how do I bridge this narrative and this takeaway, this uh, this concept, this principle, this technique, what have you? How do I put them together in 350 words? Um, and if I do that properly, then a micro article comes out. But I think, yeah, I think the most efficient way to do it is to start with dialogue, with a scene, you know, two people talking. Because again, like we were saying earlier, that talking is a really efficient way to kind of relay uh, a moment in time, instead of just exposition, instead of just telling the reader what's going on. Um, so when you use dialogue, you kind of let the reader fill in the blanks for herself. And if the dialogue alludes to a problem, to an issue, that's even better, because then you kind of got them hooked. You have them like invested in what this problem is about, or where this problem is going.
You talked about the opening line, and I remembered the what I always think of as an amazing opening line, and I know a lot of people think too, which is the opening line of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, and
Mm.
it's something like, you know, many years later, in front of the firing squad, Lieutenant Aureliano Buendia remembered the day his father took him to see ice for the first time. Something like
Yes.
that.
Yeah. So now he's in front of the firing squad, and now you got to tell the story of how he got there. So
Yes, and
yeah.
it takes about like 100 years and 7 generations of the family for you to get there. Yeah, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is an interesting one. He wrote many years before anyone else did. I think a book back. He wrote a whole book backwards. It's called The Chronicles of Death Foretold, and I think it starts with the person dying, and then it just goes back in time. And the book ends at the very beginning of this guy's journey that ended with him dying in front of, like, you open the door, the guy's dead in front of you. I think that's how it starts. And then it goes backwards. The whole book is just backwards, 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 backwards.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Memento meets John Dies at the End. Have you ever heard of that book? That's the
Uh,
title, actually. It's called John Dies at the End. So you know what's going to happen. You know the demise
yeah.
of John, the
Yeah.
protagonist.
Yeah.
It's
So So I wanted to just shift us slightly to not completely away from storytelling, but storytelling and how that interacts with copy, because a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is social media. You use it on the newsletter a lot. I tell stories in all sorts of different scenarios. Now, people love talking about storytelling and how storytelling is so important, blah blah. But when it comes to using to informing the work you do as a copywriter, I mean, what is that interaction like? Because you obviously don't have the opportunity in the vast majority of cases to tell even a short story. So how does it influence the work you spend most of your time doing?
well, you know, when I work as a in a copywriting capacity, um, I do write a lot of emails. I write a lot of email sequences, and so I do get to use, for the most part, the same techniques that I use in my newsletter, in my articles. I do get to use those um, in the emails that I write. I do get to start emails with dialogue, and if I'm writing to marketers, maybe it's a dialogue between marketers. If I'm writing to salespeople, maybe it's a dialogue between salespeople discussing the problem that this product or this service ultimately solves. So um, I do get to use those techniques in my work as a copywriter a fair bit, I think. Um, but also, a lot of advertising, a lot of marketing is um, is slice of life. You show people um, in a moment that they want to be in, or you show people in a moment that they don't want to be in. Um, you know, if you see any commercials for, uh, for medicine, for prescription drugs or anything like that, you always see, um, if it's an arthritis drug, you always see happy people running around with their grandkids, doing normal things, typical things, getting ice cream, walking down the beach, you know, cliche things almost. But those are things that we all want to do. Those are things that's important to all of us. And it's just slice of life marketing. You're telling a story about what this drug can enable you to do. And so that's how I see it. That's how I see it a lot. It's just, hey, a story doesn't have to necessarily have a beginning and a middle and an end. It could be a vignette in a way. It could be just a moment in time. Um, a lot of times I like to, and this is an exercise that I do, but I'll take a Polaroid camera and I'll take a picture of something, and then I'll try to write that picture. I'll try to express that picture in a certain number of words that I give myself. And it's a great exercise because a Polaroid picture can't really be contrived. You could take your iPhone and take 15 pictures of something and pick the best picture, but then it's not really an authentic picture. It's your version of that moment. It's the perfect version according to you. But if you take a Polaroid, the Polaroid doesn't really give you a chance to contrive it in any way. You're kind of caught, and it is what it is. And so you're forced to kind of write that picture. You're forced to write that expression on that person's face. You're forced to write that moment. And so, as a marketer, as a copywriter, doing things like that, doing exercises like that, where you kind of write the moment and you try to capture that slice of life, you try to capture that instance, um, is really good exercise. Because in some of my best work, some of my best ads, some of my best emails, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to just capture a moment in time that either people want to be in or people don't want to be in, and then just you know that's 90% of it or 80% of it, and the remaining 10 or 20% is talking about the product or the service and how it's going to enable that moment or how it's going to help you avoid that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does completely. I think I've seen you to refer to these moments in time as vignettes, and I completely agree. I think it's one of the skills that anyone trying to learn storytelling needs to learn. It's you can't edit. I mean, you can edit reality to a certain extent when you storytell by omission. You can just leave out the stuff that doesn't matter. That's just going to clog up the reader or the listener's cognitive capacities. But you can't retake it. Like you can't do, oh, this moment in time didn't turn out well. Let me retake it so it fits my point better. Like you could do that, but that would be disingenuous, and you shouldn't do that as a storyteller. So, but the point where I'm not sure, it's not that I disagree with you, but I had a very similar conversation about it recently, about having beginning, middle, and end, and I was talking to Ken Adams, who you might have heard of. He's the guy who created the story spine that a lot of people know as the Pixar pitch.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, so
Yeah.
this whole once upon a time, every day, until one day, and because of that, and because of that, and because of that, until finally, and ever since then. So that kind of structure that Pixar uses in pretty much every movie. And I was talking to him about this stuff, and he said, no. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If your story starts with you and Eddie having a conversation, that is the beginning of the story. No, that's not the beginning of the interaction between you and Eddie, and there's a context there that the reader might not be prior to, up until a certain point where we expect you're going to fill them in. But he tended to think of it as the beginning and the middle and an end are not chronological. They don't need to, the context is not the beginning. The context could be something that happens in the middle of the story. At the end of the story, there's a lot of stories where something happened and you don't know what happened, and it's only revealed to you at the end. And his argument was, it does have, like in a zero ending example, that's the end. We just chose to keep it tight or not explicit. Now you have a course that is about transformational landing pages. Now, is there
Hmm.
a place in a transformational landing page for storytelling?
Well, yeah, I guess if you look at a testimonial as a story, you know, um, you know, then yes, there is. I mean, there's all sorts of places for uh, these micro stories, these small instances, and to your point, things that are maybe aren't in order, maybe don't have a conventional kind of beginning, middle, and end. A testimonial is really just the end of the story. You know, they took your course, they applied it, and here are the results. So I think you could look at it that way for sure.
The other way that comes to mind is one that was made popular by Donald Miller and building a story brand, which is imagining that sort of hero's journey plot of any movie of a hero encounters a problem and then there's a guide and all that stuff, and their approach is to use that as a way to structure your story. So not necessarily in that order, but there is, you put something right at the beginning, so the audience, what they call the hero section of your website, right? So
Yeah.
this
Yep.
is for the audience to identify themselves with it, and the problem needs to be clear straight away, sometimes in that hero shot. And then as your website or landing page develops, it's like, okay, well, now here the problem is very clear. Now you show up as the guide, so our course or a product or whatever, and then you lead them all the way down to, say, maybe the testimonial or the slice of life where they would want to be. So I think that's the other approach that I've seen that is storytelling as a structure to be used for websites or anything else, and not, but not necessarily a story the way most people think of as a story.
Yeah. No, there's no shortage of ways to do it. There's no shortage of ways to do it. I think of like the hero section, for example. I think of it elementally. So I think of it in elements of, there's the primer, which is just there for the sake of clarity. What is this page about? What is this product about? And then I think of the headline as the promise, this big, bold, beautiful promise that you're making to whoever visited the page. And then I think of the subhead um, as a future pacing mechanism. And future pacing and copywriting is really just the way of telling the prospect what their tomorrow or their next week or next month, what their future is going to look like with your service or your product in their life. And that's a way of telling a story too, I think, you know. And there's words that can kind of trigger this future pacing uh, uh, piece. If you say something like imagine, picture this, stop doing XYZ, start doing ABC. I mean, these are all ways to kind of consciously or otherwise uh, 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 hint to us that um, you know this is about the next step in your journey. And so, the subhead is in a way a little mini story there that you're telling people. It's not very long at all, but it does create a reel sometimes if you do it well in people's minds.
Something
Creates a
you talk
visual.
about, something you talk about a lot as well is creativity. And I wanted to just before we run out of time to just pick your brain on some ideas for that. And one thing you've said before that I liked, and I think I instinctively get, at least in what I do, I get what you're saying there, but I don't think everybody would, is when you said that the most personal is the most creative. What did you, can you elaborate on that?
Well, that's something I heard Bong Joon-ho say at the Oscars when he won Best Picture for Parasite, and he said that he got that um, from his mentors. So this is something that's been passed on, I think, over the course of decades or generations. But really, it's just the idea that um, we're all the same in a way, um, and we all have different lived experiences. But what moves us as people is very similar, um, and we all have, for the most part, similar wants and desires. Our heuristics are the same. Our brains have the same triggers in them. And so when you tell a personal story, you're actually not being very personal at all because you're connecting with people, um, through this commonality that we all have. Um, and so that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is, when you say the most personal is the most creative, you know, I don't know if I would phrase it that way necessarily. That's the way Bong Joon Ho put it, so that's the way I talk about it. But creativity to me is more like what Eugene Schwartz, the way Eugene Schwartz talked about it. Eugene Schwartz was a copywriter, an excellent direct marketer, and he talked about it as creativity being this kind of empty word, and a better word for creativity is connectivity. When you put two disparate things together in a flush way and make them make sense, then you're being creative. And I think that uh, in our personal lives, there's all sorts of opportunities to tell stories about things um, that are unexpected or unusual, and you put them together into this kind of structure, like the Disney structure, the Disney format, or any kind of narrative structure. You take your personal lived experiences and you apply it to this proven kind of method, and in doing so, you're connecting things and you're being creative that way. So maybe that's another way of looking at it. Um, but generally, I like to think of it as, when you tell a personal story, you're not really telling a personal story. You're telling a universal story from your own perspective, and people are able to connect to it that way. At least that's what I found in my work. On VGC, I talk about copywriting and creativity through my lens. Through the lens, of my muses, which are, my family, my wife, my son, my friends, um, the things that I've gone through in my life. And I try to connect those things to these universal concepts around creativity and copywriting and marketing. And the most amazing thing is that people, they write back to me and they say things to the effect of, you know, I understand this. Like I get this, and I feel like when I talk about my wife or when I talk about my son, people read it and they don't see my wife. They don't see my son. They see their spouse. They see their kids. And and so I think that that's another way to look at it. That's another way to look at that Bong Joon-ho quote, is that the most personal is the most creative because the most personal is really the most universal.
Yeah, I've heard people describe that as the more specific you are, the more universal you are. And it's an interesting mental exercise we all do, which is if you describe things in a generic way where you're probably having to label people or experiences, we either struggle to see ourselves in those labels or we just don't want to. So if you say, if you're a father who does if you have a father with a young kid and you sometimes struggle with blah blah blah, it's a lot less likely that you see yourself in that label than if I just describe my struggles as a father. Um, Perhaps because when I put a label out, maybe you feel you have to match it or fit into it perfectly, and you're not trying to understand, okay, how does this apply to me? No, you're not talking about me because you're talking about a father of a young girl who's, and you don't have a you have Bo, who's a little boy. I have young girls. So if I talk about my struggles with my young girls, you're thinking, okay, but how does this apply to me? I have a boy. Okay, but actually, this is pretty much the same problem. So I don't know if it's anything to do with that, but I think when we talk about our own personal experience, we give people permission and we invite them to think about how this actually matters to them. Whereas if you're trying to nail exactly who they are through some generic description, one, people don't want to be labeled, and two, it's much harder to make that to make that fit. I think that's my that's a theory I've just developed right now, and maybe there's some truth to it.
Well, that's very impressive. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think I agree with you. Yeah.
Something you said about creativity as well, and I think it's similar to the way I work with ideas for stories and social media content, is I think you said that you collect elements,
Mm. Hmm.
which, I
Yeah.
mean, again, I know what you mean by that, but how does, what is that process, and how can people use that to find stories or any other type of ideas that they're looking for?
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, what I mean by that is, like I was saying earlier, is that every micro article is really just a collection of those three things. It's that story, that narrative, that that technique, that principle, that concept, or what have you about creativity or copywriting, and then the word count. And so the elements, I think, are like that story, those stories, and those techniques. And usually, the stories are what I'm collecting. First and foremost, because I've been a copywriter for a long time. I have a modicum of knowledge when it comes to copywriting and marketing and creativity. And usually, when I come into a story or something reminds me of a technique, um, about copywriting, about creativity, um, I make sure to write down whatever it was that reminded me, you know, and then that's that, and then I try to connect those two things. So that's what I mean by elements, is like I look for narratives, um, I look for those stories to try to tie back to techniques or principles, um, and I find that, if I have a column of all stories in column A and a column of all these techniques and principles in column B, I can kind of like mix and match them, if that makes sense. I could say, oh, I could use this story to express this idea about copywriting, or I could use this narrative to express this idea about creativity. So that's what I try to do. It doesn't all just kind of like, you know, sometimes it just kind of like it all connects automatically, and I just kind of like see it all in my head, and I can write it down right away. But for the most part, it's me noting these like remarkable things that have happened in my life, and then consciously trying to tie them back to something about the topics that I typically write about in my newsletter.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think the mistake a lot of people make when they think about creativity is that not only they're thinking about inspiration, but they're thinking of sudden inspiration. And they think that, you sit down and some idea just strikes you. And what is that quote? There's a famous quote about how someone's saying like, I only write when I'm inspired. Luckily, I'm inspired every morning at 9 a.m. when I sit in front of my typewriter or whatever.
Right. It's the mark of a professional writer is that you can't, or a professional creative person in any field. You can't just rely on inspiration because it's not very consistent.
Yeah, it's a lot more about collecting stories, collecting ideas, and you keep collecting them, and suddenly you go, oh, that thing I had collected matches perfectly with the story that I thought about. It's never there's nothing in my brain or in my notes or whatever. It is just, wow, I remember a story from 2 years ago, and this is what's gonna express this point perfectly. So no,
not that doesn't happen. I mean, it does happen sometimes, but you can't rely on it. So you have to have a different means of doing it. Like I have a document in my Google Drive. It's called The Well, and I just have probably hundreds of these little kernels, these little ideas that I can always kind of like lean on if I needed to write an article, that day or something.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even when it happens, suddenly, it happens suddenly because we fed our brains enough that there's enough stuff going on in the background that as soon as the connection is made, it comes to you fully formed, but you needed to have given the building blocks for that to happen. If there are no building blocks in there, it's not, your memory is not the building block. I mean, it can be, but it's a pretty fraught one. I think you need to more deliberately feed it as building blocks and write them down and do all of those things so that inspiration can finally hit. We've now hit the limit of our time. So just if you want to tell people, other than LinkedIn, which is a great place to follow you, but the best place for anyone to see the stuff you're up to is at verygoodcopy.com.
Yep, that's home base. Verygoodcopy.com is where I publish all of my content, and that includes articles and interviews with folks I admire and courses as well. So verygoodcopy.com.
And for anyone who doesn't feel they have any particular interest in copy or even creativity, I would say that the newsletter is still very worth subscribing to, because the last time I checked, about 54% of your emails have a story in them. So when I did the research originally, I think I had gotten 42 emails from you at that point, and 23 of them had a story in them. So 54%, 54% story to email ratio. So which is pretty
good. I appreciate you doing that, Francisco, and I appreciate this podcast and having me on and meeting you in general. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to talk to you and discuss this stuff with you. I've really enjoyed it. So I guess I'm sorry that I didn't come on sooner and that it's taken me this long, but I'm happy that I'm here now.
Perfect. I've achieved my objective for the hour. So yeah, thank you very much. This has been great fun. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.